I always say it's a good way to begin our services with bringing attention to the one who is the reason why we're here. We gather together, we become a corporate body in the sense that we all come together because of what He's done, because of what He's doing, and because of what He has yet to do. There's some things we can hope for because we've already seen them begin to come to pass. There's some things we hope for that we can't even begin to imagine. But if we can have confidence in what He has done, we can believe in what He will do. And I believe in what He's done. It's not just a hope, I have a faith. Faith has been established in my heart in some areas of my Christian walk, and by the evidentiary elements of experience. You know, experience will allow you to have a deeper faith. If you've had some experiences that have grounded you, places where you didn't have an answer and God brought an answer, places where you didn't have a way out and God made a way where there seemed to be no way, praise God. I've been in places like that where there seemed to be no way and God made a way. I've had this on my mind. I'm not going to talk about it again. I just talked about it last week. You can see the Red Sea and other examples as examples of that. Seemed to be no way in some of those stories in the Bible. Many times God brought Israel right up to the brink. Whether it was nationally or whether it was sovereignly in the sense that they're sovereign, their king, their ruler, He allowed to come up to a place. Hezekiah found himself in places like that. Jehoshaphat found himself in places like that. Sometimes these men that were trying to turn Israel and get Israel to come back to a place of right relationship with God had some of the hardest struggles even in their own personal lives. Things were coming against them, difficulties that they faced, possibility that you could lose hope. I was listening to some feedback, Sister Hope, and this isn't any pun intended. I always say that to her when I bring up her name. I'm going to talk about hope. I'm going to talk about hope and hope. I got such good feedback from our women's meeting last Wednesday night. Ladies, thank you for attending in such numbers last Wednesday night. I so appreciate that on a cold, blustery, rainy night where you couldn't hardly see where you were going, we had several dozen of our ladies make it out. We had a pretty good group of men come out too. We filled up our room where we were meeting. Had to bring in more chairs. We had a different type of meeting. You ladies were meeting for the sake of having some talks and a women's meeting and being able to be there to be of a support and encouragement to Sister Diana. It's one of our first women's meetings we've had in someone's home. There's nothing wrong with that. Do you know how many meetings they had in people's homes in the New Testament church? Before they were legally or even financially capable of building an actual building to meet in, they met in homes. When Peter was released from prison by the angel, he didn't go look for where the church house was down in the corner and found the steeple and the cross on the outside or whatever else. He went looking for a place where he knew was a house where there were people of God having a meeting. He found John Mark's mother's house, didn't he? And like there sometimes are, one of the young kids must not have been as active in the service or must have been on usher duty that night because little Rhoda is the one that answered the door when someone started knocking. Either she was fulfilling the usher duty that evening or else she wasn't quite in the middle of the service, whatever was going on upstairs, that she was close enough to answer the door. My little youngest daughter doesn't even know how to tell time yet. She came to me. I was over here talking to Sister Ruth, and she came over to me and she said, "Daddy." And I was looking at the clock. I realized it was about time for service, and I didn't know how she knew, though. She came up to me and she goes, "Daddy, it's about time to start service now." I said, "All right, we'll go ahead and have to start service." She was ready for service. I appreciate that. I appreciate that she had some cognizant understanding of the fact that it's time to get started. You know, if she didn't want to start service, that might not be such a positive, but the fact that she was eager to start service might be a good thing. Little Rhoda, whatever she was doing that evening, she was there and available. We'll give her some praise for that. She was available to open the door. Well, she didn't do it at first. I think she was a little too afraid to open the door. She thought that Peter was there, and however you choose to interpret that, whether it was Peter in a celestial form or whether she thought it was Peter's guardian angel or whatever it may have been she thought was outside the door, she was afraid to open the door. So she went up and told somebody else before the door got opened. They didn't have the same type of opportunity we have when we gather together. They met in homes like our ladies met in here Wednesday night. One day may come when this present cultural and political system may not allow you to have church in an organized fashion. You could study how the government operates in other countries even today. There's countries today that don't allow people to have church in any kind of an organized way. And some of them will allow you to have it in an organized way, but not by your own choosing. It'll be according to the structural description that they have for it. You can have it like this. It might be able to be this long. You better not talk about this, that, or the other. And I can promise you, you certainly aren't going to be talking about politics in the church service in any way, shape, or form, or you'll be in danger of your life. It may just be we'll find ourselves in the situation where we'll need to be a little more flexible. You know, there is an advantage to being flexible. It's hard to do. The older we get, the more difficult it is to be flexible. We get into patterns, we get into grooves, we get into channels where this is how I do things, and I don't like my apple cart upset. I don't like to do things outside my comfort zone. That's one thing. We need to make sure we keep our relationship with the Lord fresh enough that however He chooses to communicate to us, however He chooses to interact with us, or whatever direction He may take in terms of our activity, we need to be flexible to be able to do that. I was thinking about that this week. I said I've changed the schedule on you all so many times this last month that nobody's got mad at me yet. Isn't that wonderful? What a sweet church that we have. Everybody just smiles. All right, Brother Bear, we'll do that. We've had to make some changes here and there. And it's a good exercise for us to be flexible, to realize that we need to be minute men, so to speak. We had a pastor in years gone by that used to say that it's important for ministers to be minute men. As I suppose he was using the statement that Paul said to Timothy, that you should be instant, in season, and out of season. Well, what do you think that means to be instant, in season, and out of season? I think I heard Sister Polly say ready all the time. That's a good practical bottom shelf way to put it. That means you're always prepared, always ready. Whatever we have to do, we'll do it. If there's a change or something happens or there's a different need, we'll adjust to meet that need. It's really the way that we have our services, which is a little different than some elements of Christendom. What we've felt is that we want to have a service that is led by the Spirit, so we don't plan out much of our services. We generally do start with songs. We generally do have a prayer in the beginning. We almost always end with a prayer. We have an offering some point in the service. So I guess there's some kind of a structural outline to it, but there's no real order to that. If I felt the Lord here this morning and I felt a need to talk to you immediately as soon as I walked in, as in terms of something I felt was so intensively heavy on my shoulders, that we probably wouldn't have even begun with a song service. We would have begun with some preaching or some teaching. If somebody felt a terrible need to unburden their soul or to testify here in the very beginning of the service, they have the freedom to do that. Nobody's going to say, hold on, sister or brother, it's time to start our song service. We don't have time for you to say something here. We want to be led of the Spirit in every aspect of what we do. We want to be led of the Spirit in our personal lives as well. What we do on a corporate level in the church ought to be a reflection of what we do in our homes. If you're living a certain life within the walls of the church, it ought to translate into what you do at home, shouldn't it? What you do out in the street, shouldn't it? We ought to be the type of Christians that, and I hope we are, that however we present ourselves in the church in terms of our spiritual life would be how the world would see us outside the church. That there'd be no disconnect. If the world sees you somewhere and says, oh, I thought that person was a churchgoer, but look at the way they're acting or living or presenting themselves, there ought to be no disconnect. And one of the easiest ways for us to disconnect is in some visible way. You know, we go somewhere that would be a shame for a Christian to go to. We're involved in some activity that would be shameful for a Christian to be involved in. We're dressed in some way that would be lewd or would be compromising our modesty in some way. Those are the visible and obvious things, saints. That's a very beginning level of Christian faith for you to get the disciplines over your life that you don't go the wrong places, you don't do the wrong things. When we start to grow more in our Christian faith, we come to a place where we get into the more difficult things. And that is not just the outward man, what people see, but what people feel and what's going on inside your head. What people feel and what you're actually thinking and whether or not that translates itself into some kind of a feeling that people have is very critical for your Christian walk. It usually isn't what we think about right away. And when we've got a number of people right now suffering with different conditions, our responsibility toward them is to make sure we keep a good, pleasant environment for them, least amount of tension, encourage them, keep their spirits up, make sure that they feel the love of God, they feel encouraged. There's some difference between hope and faith. There's some difference between what you feel inside and how that communicates itself to other people. What I mean by that is this. There's times you go out in the world and you're doing things that speak pretty loud about whether or not you're really a Christian in your day-to-day life. Some things you may not think about as much that speak pretty loud too. You realize that Christians are children of hope. I read somewhere here not long ago that there is no pagan god that you could pray to for hope. Whether you want to study the Mesopotamian gods, and so many of these are interrelated, by the way. They influence each other's development of their hierarchy of gods. But whether you want to study the Mesopotamian gods, whether you want to study the Far Eastern gods and philosophies, whether you want to study the Greco-Roman gods, whether Greek or Roman, and they were so interrelated and almost synonymous, some of them, there's no God of hope. There's no God that gives you a feeling that you can make it. There's gods you might pray to for some benefit, like maybe I want to be able to have some more abundance, I want to be able to have a better crop, return on my investment, whatever it might be. But there is no God you can pray to for hope, and there's no God you can trust in for hope. And you'll find if you study the deities of paganism that you won't find one. But we have a God that intends us to live in hope. It doesn't matter where we are in a present tense. The present tense is not the end of things for the Christian believer. Wherever we find ourselves presently, we've got a future hope. We even have a present hope. Because if you live in hope, it'll change your whole mindset. It'll change the way you think about things. It'll change the way you act. It'll change the mood you're in. It'll change even, in some ways, the health that you have. I've found myself, the more stressed I get, the easier it is for me to get a cold or something else that would get a hold of you. It's easier to do that. You know why? Your immune system is weakened when your mental state is weakened. It goes along parallel with anything you do to your mind. Whenever you lessen the ability of your mind to have strength to resist something, you put yourself in a dangerous predicament. It's why I am so strongly opposed to putting anything in your body that would change the state of your mind, that would lower your inhibitions. Now you can make a list once I said that. I didn't even have to name a thing, did I? That would lower your inhibitions, that would lower your ability to make clear, conscious choice. When you put that in your body, you've just lowered your ability to resist sin. Just think about this from a Christian standpoint. I heard this almost ludicrous argument made against this Baptist preacher about why he was resisting. I think it was okay for Christians to take in certain things that would intoxicate them. And they really just tore him up one side and down the other about that. I wish somebody that had enough knowledge of the Greek, and I would have liked to have done it, could have stood across from him and said, you don't know what you're talking about. That's not what that word means. Or had enough knowledge of the culture that could have said, you don't even understand the sugar content in the Middle East. Haven't thought about that, have you? There's a difference in the sugar content in fruit in the Middle East than there is here. There's a difference in the way it ferments. There's a difference in how long it takes to ferment. They beat up on this poor minister over that. And I thought to myself, you're not even taking the practical reason for this into context. What Christian would want to lower their ability to resist sin? What Christian would think it would be okay to lower your capability to resist sin? And when you intoxicate yourself, your ability to resist sin becomes lower. We are trying to guard our hearts in a more stringent way rather than to let our guard down. We're trying to be more guarded. We're trying to be more pure. We're trying to restrain the desires of the flesh in a greater way, not leaving openings and to cause you to do something that would be despicable of some kind. I'm not going down that track today. That's something more for a Bible study we could talk about. But what I do want to make a point about is where our state of mind is at. And I was listening to some of the feedback, Sister Hope, about the women's meeting, and there was good feedback about almost everything that happened in that meeting. All of it seemed to be so positive and so uplifting. I think I heard some of the strongest feedback, though, about your talk and your involvement in the prayer there at the end of that, how strong that was, what a benefit it was, how it blessed. And I think, if I understand it correctly, Sister Hope, so I said you're going to forgive me, talked about hope. Is that right, Sister Hope? You talked about hope. Hope's an important thing, saints. When we start to lose our hope, faith will follow if it hasn't already been lost. Hope is a little different from faith. There's a significant difference between faith and hope and love. The end of the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, he said, now abideth these three, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And I heard somebody say one time, how do you differentiate between faith and hope? Well, let me ask you this question in return. Maybe this will make it real simple for you. Can you have faith that something bad is going to happen? Can you convince yourself something bad is going to happen to where you've almost got faith? This is going to happen. Things are going to go bad. It's going to be bad. You can have negative faith, can't you? I'm not talking about religious faith. I'm talking about faith in anything. People have faith their ball team is going to win today, whatever team it might be. Well, you can have negative or positive faith, can't you? Hope's a little bit different than that, at least hope in the way that the Greek word means it in the New Testament. Hope is a positive expectation. Faith can be positive or negative. Now, if it's positive, it's powerful because it's a belief that you're convinced something's going to happen. But if it's negative, it's powerful too, because you can convince yourself negatively something's going to happen, and you can make it happen to you. Hope is more of an anticipation of something. You're not positively anticipating something bad's going to happen to you, are you? Oh, it'd be wonderful if I got hit in the head with something today. You're not thinking positively about that. But you could say, I believe this pressure in my head's going to turn into a migraine. Do you see how there's a difference between faith and hope? We've got to keep a guard on both of those things. They each interrelate with one another, and so does love. Faith and hope are very close sisters. And you've got to have a very strong uplifting of your hope if your faith is going to be strong. You get up on a mountaintop, and a lot of times this is what happens with us as Christians in our Christian experience. You get up on a mountaintop, and you look out over that vista ahead of you, and you see where you're going, and it's just like the mirage of how far mountains look away from you in the desert. It looks a lot closer than it really is, doesn't it? If you know anything about that effect of a long, flat landscape with something in the distance, quite often you look out across there, it looks like, well, yeah, we can make that in a day, and it may be 5 days from here to get to that. You look out from a high place, and a lot of times it'll give you a lot of hope. You'll say, I believe, I've got an expectation and anticipation that I can make it. But I'll tell you, you won't really get faith till you're in the valley. That's what's hard for us to wrap our heads around as Christians, is that you're going to have to go through the valley too. It's easy to have hope on the mountaintop when everything looks like, look, I'm in a good place, things are going good, I can see where I'm going, I can see where the destination is, I believe I can make it. But down in the dark where it's cold and things aren't going right is where your faith will get tested, and you'll either develop a positive or a negative faith. Negatively, you could say, I just can't make it. I don't think I can make it. That's a dangerous place for a Christian to be, because there's different levels of what your hope is in the Bible. You're into expectation. Our expectation isn't just to have peace and well-being and health and life and material things in this life. We unfortunately have a great wave of charismatic individuals that are rising up in this generation that are convinced that the purpose of the Christian life is health, wealth, and blessing in this life, and the only reason you're not getting it is that you don't have enough faith. You just name it and claim it, you're going to have it. That isn't the way God works, saints. You can't make God move against His own will. And some things, God's will may not be for you to have something. If God intends you to go through a place, and He's going to wait till you get through that place before He delivers you, you're not going to get delivered out of it until He gets you through it. He'll go through it with you, though. If you realize He's with you, you can have some hope. It'll give you confidence. That's why I say any of our folks that we're going to visit, you ought to give them as much hope as you can when you visit them. Let them know that wherever God takes us, He's with us. Wherever we end up, we'll be with God. Whether in this life or in the next, the Christian hope is not just based in the present. It is primarily reaching out to the future. It's strange we've had this word. It seems like about everybody I've talked to, you had in your women's meeting, other people that have talked, it seems like the word hope just keeps on floating to the surface. Because hope is our anticipation and expectation that something good is going to happen. Do you know, right now, even though we've got saints that are in pain and suffering, I still believe something good is going to happen. That good could be in this life or it could be in the next. And wherever we find ourselves in the process, it still can be a good thing for us if the process is completed in us. No matter how difficult I've found places in my life to be, and trying and challenging and uncertainty that's come upon me in different places, it's my response to that condition that determined whether or not when I came out the other side, I was better or worse off for the condition. There's some things you can go through, and when you get on the other side, you're in a worse state of mind than you started. But a Christian ought not to be so, saints. When I talked here about how we present ourselves in the public, I meant that in terms of the public right out here on the street, but as well as when we're visiting one another and anything else. We are children of hope. Everything we do is based on hope. Everything we do is based on an anticipation that God will do something in our behalf. Now, He might do it today. He might do it tomorrow. It may take months. And maybe it won't even be this lifetime that He'll do it in. But you know what's so encouraging about the faith that we have? Even if God doesn't answer all your prayers today, even if God doesn't meet every need you have today, even if you don't get what you want out of this life, you've got another life promised to you, praise the God of heaven. There's a resurrection out ahead. Our present hope is, Lord, you're able, and we hope that you do. We're really longing for you to be able to answer some of these prayers. But saints, whether He answers those prayers or not, He will raise some people up in the resurrection. The hope that you have in the future is a guaranteed hope. It's not like some of these things that we don't know. Lord, what's your will in this? Why haven't you answered? Why won't you answer? There's some things you can get your ticket stubbed for, and it's a done deal. You'll have that opportunity. Whether you're the one that's suffering and going through a desperate condition, or whether you're the one trying to encourage somebody. I don't want anybody to lose their hope. I don't want anybody to lose their vision of where they're going. And the fact that whatever we go through, there's still something on the other side. Nothing we do as Christians has an end to it in this life, because there's that great hope of the resurrection. I was reading here lately this survey that they took of 700, it was almost 800, I think it was 795 seniors that they took a survey of about 10 or maybe 15 years ago. They did a survey of almost 800 senior citizens. And they asked them in this survey whether they had hope for their future. Now, these were all elderly saints. So you could look at that from a lot of variety of ways. If you're 80 years old, you could say, well, I might have a few years left to live, or maybe I've got 10 or 20 years left to live. But all of it is a state of mind in terms of whether you've got hope. For someone to ask you how many years do you have left to live is not the same thing as saying, do you have hope? I might have one day left to live, but I might have hope. I could have 50 years left to live. I don't know if I will. I might be able to have that left to live if the Lord tarries. If I could be as healthy as dear Sister Mildred, she's 97 years old, saints. And she's wanting to get out of there and get back to church. And I hope she can. But you know, you could have hope whether you're 90 years old or whether you're 40 years old. There's hope. No matter what we lose, you don't have to lose your hope. You may lose everything, but you don't have to lose your hope. You know what's so precious, though? Maybe you haven't really considered it in these terms. Since we use Job so often talking about being in a state where God isn't answering prayer and you're suffering and you don't know why, you realize that Job is one of the strongest Old Testament passages in the 14th and in the 19th chapters to the hope of the resurrection. There was a reason the Sadducees and Pharisees warred back and forth over whether or not there was a resurrection. Because the Sadducees legitimately thought there's really not a solid statement in the Scripture that says you're going to have a resurrection. And if you look at it from the surface, there's only a few statements that you could get out of the Old Testament that would give you hope that there'll be a resurrection. So they might have been legitimate in arguing that. It was the ultra-Orthodox, strict position. I don't see that. You'd have to make allegory out of some of those statements to get a resurrection. Here Job was one of the examples of terrible suffering, one of the examples of God lifting off from an individual and not even touching them and leaving them alone to suffer for a while, a long while, in one terrible wave of suffering after another. And guess what? In the middle of that suffering, almost the dead middle when you get to the 19th chapter, in the middle of Job's account, in the 14th chapter and the 19th chapter, Job made these statements in the midst of his deepest state of despair. He made statements regarding the hope of the fact that even if he died, even if he lost his life in this terrible suffering through, I do know that one day I'm going to stand on the earth and see my Redeemer with my own eyes, and that in my flesh I'll be able to look right on that Redeemer. What a promise. Then he said, what about man? He's like a tree that falls down. And is there any hope for a man? Is there any hope for men when they fall down and die, whether or not there's any hope? He painted a little picture in the midst of those passages that would give you hope that is alluded to, at least, in the Old Covenant. I want to finish what I started saying about this survey that I had read here lately. 795 seniors, and they said that they just asked them one question. How much hope do you feel within you about the future? Not the future of the political system, not the future of the economic systems of this world. Because none of those things, saints, have anything to do with our Christian hope, do they? If the economic system of this world collapses, it will directly affect you and I, you're right. But it should not affect our hope. If the wrong person is in the White House or the wrong percentage of conservatives is influencing our nation or any other political statement, if that's the case, that might discourage us, but it shouldn't change our Christian hope. Do you think that the electoral college of this nation can change the will of God for this nation? Do you think the voting box can somehow change God's course and current that He complete in this country? Do you think any man being elected to any office can change God's course of where He intends to take things? So it shouldn't change your hope. And even if whether you live or whether you die, whether you're in a condition of life or whether somebody takes your life, it still should not change your Christian hope. It would be interesting to see what percentage of these 795 were Christian. But these 795 senior citizens they did this study of, and again, the only question really was, do you have hope for yourself, personal hope about your own life? And they came back in 5 years to this group of seniors and found this unusual fact. It shouldn't surprise you. As old as they were, you had to expect some of them would probably pass in that 5-year period. Out of the ones that passed, of the ones that said they have hope for the future, only 11% of them passed in that 5-year period. Of the ones that said, I don't have any hope for the future, 29% of them died in that 5-year period. It should tell us something about what your state of mind can do. You get in the wrong state of mind. You get this idea that things can't get better. They won't get better. It's a dangerous place to be, saints. It's dangerous for someone suffering. It's dangerous for anybody praying for them. Not going to do you much good to pray for somebody if you're convinced they can't be helped. We've got a number of people right now we're praying for. This prayer list, though praise the God of heaven, Sister Jean, has gotten a little shorter. She left me a message this week that she was taking several names off the prayer list, and several prayers have been answered. Thank God for answered prayer, saints. We've had a lot of that, but this prayer list still has a little bit of length to it, doesn't it? We've got to print up a page-long prayer list in what looks like about 8-point font. That's a long list of needs, isn't it? You ought not to lose hope because there's a long list of needs here. You realize the hope of the world came when the world was in its greatest need. Israel was in its darkest moment. If you make a study of the empires that ruled over Israel, Egypt was pretty bad. Assyria was pretty bad in their influence, especially over the northern tribes. You come on down a little further down the line, a couple hundred years, Babylon was pretty bad. Medo-Persia wasn't all that great. They did do some things in terms of letting them have their city back. Greece wasn't so great. They were all right at first under Alexander the Great. He got along pretty well with the Jews, but the ones that followed him after his 4 generals and their descendants, it became a pretty nasty business for the Jews under Antiochus Epiphanes and others. But no matter what level of persecution they went through, Rome was by far the worst. When it's described in the book of Daniel, it describes each of those animals that came up out of the sea. And then finally it describes this great beast, terrible and dreadful, with these terrible iron fangs. It describes it in a much more graphic and frightening way than any of the other beasts. Rome was a terrible burden to the Jews, and they did more of a massacre of the Jews than any nation or empire did. What greater time was there to have a need for Jesus? I appreciate there were people like Simeon and Anna in that day. I appreciate there were people that in a day when it looked like living right wouldn't reap any reward. There are days like that. We're in a day like that right now where it would appear on the surface that living right won't reap any reward. I'm not talking about money either. I'm talking about a spiritual reward. What good does it do to live right? The wicked live as evil as they want. Look how well off they are. Psalmist said, my feet well nigh slipped when he saw the prosperity of the wicked. Doesn't look like there's any reward that can be reaped out of righteousness. But don't you appreciate that Zacharias and Elizabeth were living a holy life? You know, in the midst of that entire generation, there were a lot of people descended from Levi. Mary had other relatives. God was not forced to choose Zacharias and Elizabeth to be the parents of the forerunner of Christ, John the Baptist. They were the right family, but He wasn't forced by that. He's not forced to choose us either, saints. Zacharias and Elizabeth were living a holy life, and God knew that if He chose them, they'd raise that child in such a way that that child would be ready to be used when God put His hand on him. In the midst of a perverse and a wicked generation. But in that same generation, here was all these Jews pleading for the coming of a Messiah, and many of them had lost hope that the Messiah would ever come. Many of them had lost any expectation. That's all hope is. I said it's anticipation in a positive way. They lost their hope of the Messiah. I usually talk about it around Christmas time. This incredible rabbinical story of what was going on during the time when Jesus was born. One of the most significant things being that the Roman Empire took away from the Sanhedrin, away from the Jewish government, their spiritual government, the ability to pass the death penalty. And to us, that wouldn't seem like such a significant thing. To them, it meant everything. Because if you've got somebody that's supposed to be stoned or somebody that's done some abomination, and the law of God says they're to be killed for the crime, now you can't kill them for the crime. And Rome may not see that as a crime. They might not be worried about whether or not that person went out and did some worthy of death. They may say that's not serious enough to die. We're not worried about what the Torah says about that. But the Jews were very serious about it. They wanted to maintain the integrity of the law. And so when the Romans, right around the time Jesus was born, they took away the ability of the Jews to legally pass the death sentence. They allowed them some other things, but they took away from them the ability to legally pass the death sentence. It put them in a pretty stirred up state of mind. And some of the rabbinical writers could not understand how the promises of God could be broken. Here's how seriously they took Genesis 49:9, where it makes that statement about Judah. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. When they were told that they no longer had the authority, they took that to mean that the Romans have taken away the ability for there to be a lawgiver, the ability for us to pass punishment when someone breaks the law, and Shiloh's not here. People were beginning to lose their faith because it looked like God's promises were broken and the Messiah had not come. That's where we can get mentally if we don't realize just where we're really at. We can lose our hope. And in the midst of that generation, there's only a couple people that are even mentioned that still were really waiting in expectation for an immediate arrival of somebody. One of them was Simeon and one was Anna. And that dear man and that dear lady were waiting with expectation for his coming. Now you'd think if you were an elderly person, and we've got a number of them in our assembly, we've got more possibly that are seniors here today than even is normally the case. But saints, you'd think as an elderly person, after you had been in the temple every day for so long, eventually you'd start to get tired of coming up to the temple looking for this one. I know one day the Lord's going to let me see him, but I've come up here for months and years, and I still haven't seen him. And I'm getting pretty old, and I still haven't seen him. It looks to me like there was a hope burning down in the hearts of Simeon and Anna that didn't matter how long they had to wait. If God said you're going to see it, we're going to stick around until we see it, praise the God of heaven. How about you? You want to stick around until we see some of these things? My prayer to God in all these situations we're praying about has been, God, let your will be done. And whatever you choose to do, give me and anyone else involved in it the peace to be able to subject ourselves to that will. Whatever God's will is, I want it to be done. That's part of the prayer that the Lord instructed the disciples to pray. Thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. But I want to be in subjection to God. It will give you peace when you find yourself in subjection to God. When you start to tie together these three cords of faith and hope and love, and they each are alive and dynamic and working, and they start to bind together, those three things need to be interwoven. It'll give a lot better strength to your Christian walk. It's a difficult thing to have hope in what you think God is doing if you don't believe God loves you. You see how they can interrelate to each other? It's awfully hard to have faith if you don't really have love. Now, love is a two-way street. I don't mean that. I'm not talking about marriage here today. I'm talking about your relationship with God. Love is a two-way street even with God. It's not enough just for God to love you. You've got to love God. And vice versa. It's not enough just for you to love somebody. They've got to love you. Who do you think I'm going to tell you we need to learn to love? Beyond the Godhead, beyond that divine government, who do you need to learn to love? Each other. The greatest commandment, right, is first to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then to love your neighbor as yourself. You notice that neither one of those said, the great commandment is learn to love yourself, and then you'll love God and other people better. Psychologists will tell you, you got to love yourself. If you don't love yourself, you can't love anybody else. Well, that is probably true in a very selfish society, because if you don't get your way, you're not going to want anyone else to have theirs. If you take it right down to the nuts and bolts of it, if I'm not happy, why should anyone else be? Don't say amen. You don't want to agree with that, do you? But that is how a lot of people are. Psychologists will tell you, you got to learn to love yourself. Let me show you where that is a little bit off kilter from an actual biblical understanding. It's not so much that you need to learn to love yourself, but you need to know that you're loved. Do you understand the difference? There's a difference between learning to love yourself, because who doesn't love themselves? They may not like themselves, but everybody loves themselves. There's things I don't like about myself, but if my life's on the line, I can tell you I probably do love myself. I don't want to give up life, do I? But there is a difference, and I'm going to tell you right now, if you know that you're loved, you'll be able to love others a whole lot better. You notice how the Scripture says it? It says we love Him. Why? Because He first loved us. So the psychologists have a little bit of it right. They've got right the idea that you have to know your love before you really can reciprocate. That's how humans are. We're limited that way. God doesn't need to know you love Him to love you. That's where God is so much further superior than we are in terms of His emotional construct. He doesn't need to know whether you love Him or not. He loved you before you ever loved Him. Jesus loved you before you even knew Him. Jesus is willing to love you enough to lay down His life on the cross and pour out His precious blood for you, even for people who don't love Him and maybe never will love Him. He was willing to die on a cross. That is godly love. That's what the King James Version translates charity in some places, agape. That is a divine love. The idea that you don't need to have reciprocal love. You're going to love anyway. Now, our society likes that phrase too. They use it to excuse sin. Isn't it amazing how the devil will just twist a truth a little bit? Here's how he twists another truth. We need to love everybody. No matter what they're doing, no matter what kind of sins they're doing, you're right, you need to love them, but they bend that a little bit further than that you need to tolerate that. Do you know love and toleration are not the same thing? I can love my children, but if they're screaming at the top of their lungs, I'm not going to tolerate it very long. It didn't change my love for them, did it? God has no intention of tolerating some of the wickedness that's going on in our culture right now. That doesn't mean He doesn't love those sinners. Now that is something that is far beyond most of us in terms of our human ability to do that. It's easier for us to love somebody that we can relate to, somebody that we feel good about. Oh, I really love that person. And when you start to really analyze why you love them, it's because you have similarities, you get along well, they've done things that please you. You usually aren't making those statements after they just kicked you in the shin, are you? Oh, praise God, I love that person. Right after they socked you in the nose. No, that's usually not when we're saying that. We respond with love because of what we feel. We're limited in respect to the way God responds to love. He just loves, but He doesn't tolerate. The conundrum between the fact that God desires you to have safety, God desires you to have peace, God desires you not to suffer, but He has to allow you to suffer. That's a conundrum. Do you know what a conundrum is? That's when a riddle gets in your brain and it's no way to unravel the thing. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to us humans that a God who is able to deliver us would require us to go through some difficult situation. How's that possible? It's one of the atheists' strongest arguments, they think. A God that can stop pain, why does He allow pain? If He's a God of love and He's holy, why does He allow pain? Well, you just hit it. Sometimes the only way for Him to get you in a place where He can give you the greatest gift that could ever be given. You know, the greatest gift is not release from pain. The greatest gift is not the end of disease. The greatest gift is not the end of sorrow. Though all those things are part of the package of benefits you'll have in the world to come, those aren't the greatest gifts. The greatest gifts are to get in to the world to come. The greatest gifts are to have the promise of life. It's not a more abundant life today that's as important as life tomorrow. We're worried about today. We don't understand. Sometimes God will allow us to go through experiences because He wants us to be able to live in the world He's created for tomorrow. And some of those experiences are intended to deliver us right into that world in a state where we'll be ready to exist in that eternity to come. And He wants to take us through some of those processes. That's kind of an unusual way to look at hope, isn't it? You don't feel like you have much hope when things aren't going well for you. But saints, all things work together for good to them that are the called according to God's purpose and those that love God. I said it different, we usually quote it. When you're called according to God's purpose and you love God, things will work out. If there's a little clue in there, a lot of times you think, well, I love God. You know, you really can't love God properly if you're not certain He loves you. I hope you realize how important that is. You can't really love God, not really, if you don't believe He loves you. Until you truly can entrust yourself to Him and you believe He has your best interest at heart, you can't really say, I fully love Him. I love Him with all of my heart. No, you don't. Because perfect love casteth out fear. What fear? Fear of betrayal, fear of hurt, fear of the unknown, Brother Wren said. If you know without a shadow of a doubt that the God of heaven loves you, you won't have any need for fear. That doesn't mean you won't experience trouble, but you won't have to fear it. Because whatever trouble you experience will be beneficiary to you in your final salvation of what God intends to work out in you, if you know He loves you. If you're not sure that He loves you, then whatever you're going through may be pointless and meaningless. And pain that is pointless is a very difficult thing to deal with. If you think you're going through something and there's no meaning behind it, there's no point, it isn't going to help me, it's not going to accomplish anything, that will cause you to get into a deep state of depression. It's like meaningless work. You ever dug holes and filled them back in? That, I suppose, is one thing they think is discipline in the military. They just want to see if you'll do idiot work for long enough and not say a word about it. So you go dig a trench. Spend a day or two digging the trench. You're proud as can be of that trench. Well, I really did a good work. Okay, now go back and fill it in. We don't need that thing. So it meant nothing. Your work was pointless. Hard to work when you think it's pointless, isn't it? It's hard to do something when there's no point. The point that you can have as a Christian to whatever you're going through is your hope of what is yet to come. You can hang on to that hope and have a realization that there are things ahead of us. There are some wonderful benefits ahead of us. There was another study that I had read not long ago, and they had studied individuals who were in a negative frame of mind about their particular condition. They were in a state of despair. The study originated with them studying smoking and how smoking affects your heart. And they found out what percentage of people develop atherosclerosis, I guess is the technical term for it, when your arteries start to narrow and tighten down, which is a very dangerous thing. They said 20% of people that smoke a pack a day will definitely, without a doubt, develop this atherosclerosis, where your arteries will get smaller and smaller. Strange thing they found out in this study is that the same exact percentage of people who think that they're going to be sick and have problems, their arteries get smaller. Isn't that a strange thing? You've got the same chance of having medical problems if you're in a negative state of mind as somebody that smokes a pack of cigarettes a day. Believe me, I'm 100% against smoking. But sometimes we'll say, well, that person's having trouble because diet they have, or they're doing this or that or the other. We can poison our own selves, our own thoughts, saints, if we're not careful. I want us all to make sure we keep our spirits up. It's my hope in regard to all the conditions right now that we have been visiting, the 3 or 4 different ones that we've been traveling to see. It's my hope that every single one of them will get their strength back and be sitting here in the house of the Lord. I see that already beginning in several. I have the hope in all that God will give that strength, that they'll be enabled to be here, working the way they've always worked, engaging themselves in the activity of the church in the way they've always engaged. Saints, we've got some younger people who should not be suffering the way they're suffering. It's our responsibility to make sure they've got their hope buoyed as often as we can. It's our responsibility to get in around them and encourage them. It's our responsibility to make sure their faith is strong. And whatever God chooses to do, that they have hope for the future. Because our hope isn't just limited to today. It's not just limited to what's going on in the present tense. So I've got hope. If I had this little song on a sheet that someone had given me, and it's funny because it fits so well in with what I was thinking as I walked in here today. It's an old youth choir song. And the words of that song say, I can make it. What do you think about that? You don't even need to say any more, do you? I can make it. We will make it. Now, we'll either make it where we need to go in this life or we will make it in the next. But you and I are going to reach our destination. No matter what happens in this life, you and I are going to reach our destination. Are you committed to that? Do you want to make it to the end? Because I do. I want to hold my faith steadfast to the end. Praise the God of heaven. I don't want to do anything with wavering. I want to hold my faith steadfast to the end, to the very end. Said Abraham hoped against hope. That's Romans 4. Here was Abraham. 16th verse says, therefore it is of faith that it might be by grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham. This promise that God gave to Abraham doesn't just apply to the seed under the law, which is the Jew. It applies to all the seed of Abraham, of which you also belong as a household of faith. And he's the father of us all. Paul wasn't writing just the Jews. He was the father of us all, Jew and Gentile. As it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations, before whom also he believed, even God who quickeneth the dead. Now, I don't want you to miss this. And calleth those things which be not as though they were. There's one of our strongest reasons for hope, saints. God can call those things which be not as though they are. Which means even something that is not even tangible and dynamically alive, God can make it being just like that. He doesn't need to work with anything. He can bring it out of nothing. Praise His holy name. Praise God, Sister Hope. I think she was the one I was talking to. Said whatever state our saints get in, it didn't change anything about God's omnipotent power. If somebody just heard they might have cancer, or somebody finds out they have terminal cancer, that didn't change anything about God. God calls those things that are not as though they are. Which means the things that are impossible to you and I, and we cannot accomplish, God is more than able to accomplish. And one of these days, if we do go to our grave, and we go back to the dust, and the wind blows us all over creation, and you could never pick out all the little molecular pieces of ash and bone and everything else that might have made up your genetic structure at one point in your poor, feeble, limited human life. Somebody asked me this question, is it okay to be cremated? Or is it okay to be thrown in the ocean? What difference does it make? Do you think a Jew that loved the God of heaven that died in a house fire is not going to be resurrected because he went to the ash? It doesn't really matter what happens to this old mud hut you're living in. It doesn't make any difference. Because the DNA that makes up who you are and the soul life that's recorded in the mind of God, where God is aware of your memories and who you were and how you were and what you did and how you acted, those things will never pass because the God of heaven has recorded those things in His book. And if your body goes to the dust and is blown away to the four winds and nobody could ever pick up all the little pieces, God calls those things that are not as though they were. Which means all He has to do is speak your name. He doesn't have to go find your body somewhere to get you out of the grave. He just has to speak the name. And when the name comes out, encompassed in that name is all the memory and the life and the DNA that made you who you are, and that name becomes flesh. It happened with His Son, didn't it? God just spoke a word. That's all it took for Him to put the life of His precious Son right down the womb of Mary. He didn't have to work some kind of a biological operation to do that. The Spirit covered little Mary, and the Word entered into that womb of that girl. And it didn't have to pass through the membrane of her body or anything else. God can reach right through anything He chooses to and do what He wills with it. The things that limit us, the barriers and walls that hedge us in, but these walls that seem to hedge us in and limit us are no limitation to God. These conditions that look like they're insurmountable are little molehills, as they used to say to God. My grandpa used to say it doesn't amount to a hill of beans. So here was Abraham, and he said, who against hope. Hope and faith are two different words in the Greek New Testament. The word hope here and belief. The word believed here comes from the word faith. Faith in the Greek is pistis, P-I-S-T-I-S. This word comes from that word. It's basically an extension of the word for faith, where it says belief. So you're going to put who had faith as well. Who against hope had faith in hope, or believed in hope. Now what an unusual and contradictory thing to seem to say. Let's put it in a modern colloquialism. When all hope was lost, Abraham continued to believe and hope. That's one way you could put that. Anybody else looking at the condition would say there's no hope. Whether or not the physical conditions of individuals suffering are alleviated in this life, The hope that I have is that God is in control, and I will see that individual whether tomorrow or in the resurrection, and that hope no one can steal. You may feel like someone's stolen away from you if you lose a dear saint, but the hope to see them again is not lost, saints. You will see them again if they're a child of God. And against hope, Abraham believed in hope, that he might become many nations. According to that which was spoken, so shall thy seed be. And being not weak in faith, he considered not his own body now dead when he was about 100 years old, neither yet the deadness of Sarah's womb. You know, there's two different things at least Abraham had to face that was a challenge to his faith in regard to his children. One of them was the deadness of his womb and his wife's womb. The fact that here's a 100-year-old man, what amounts to a 90-year-old woman around those ages at that time, you're not going to have children. You would be hoping against hope to think you're going to have children. Because no one in their right mind would join the bandwagon with you to sit down and say, well, yeah, it's possible. There's some places we get to where everybody says it's not possible. Everybody has come to the conclusion that this is as far as God can take it. But God can go much further than you. And in the case of Abraham, he hoped against hope. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, and he did one of the most important things that you very seldom see in the movement of charismatics in our day, and that is they like to talk about how strong they are in faith, but they never give glory to God. They give glory to whoever's doing the praying, and they say, if your faith is just strong enough, so-and-so will heal you. If your faith is strong enough, if it's God's will, and if you give God the glory, He'll heal you, and maybe He'll use a man to do it. But one thing we better never forget is to give God the glory. Give God the glory. What has He done already, saints? How many things has He already done that we ought to lift His name up and give Him the glory for? Say, God, You've done a lot already, and we're not going to stagger. We're not going to stagger, Lord. We're going to have belief for the future of our folks that are suffering and of our families and of the hope that lies before us, because it's sure and it's steadfast and it is an anchor, saints. An anchor holds you no matter what the storm, that enters into that which is behind the veil. And if you've anchored into Jesus and into the throne of God behind the veil, you don't have to worry about this present life. Because one day, if you're anchored to that is within the veil, your ship will find itself drawn beyond the veil into the presence of the Almighty God.